Tonight we will be going over 6 stories, from a story of a private investigator, a mysterious plague doctor, ghosts, and more. This video is going to have many surprises throughout. A huge thank you to the writers for allowing me to share their stories. Remember, you can send in your own story to rylhstories@gmail.com. The author of the first story in tonight's lineup has recently released a new book. It is available on Amazon, and I'll be leaving a link to it in the description. This isn't a paid promotion or anything. It was very kind of them to allow me to share their story with you all, and I know you guys are interested in scary stories, or at least I'd hope so. So if you get done listening to the video and you decide you'd be interested in checking it out, feel free to follow the link. I bet they'd appreciate it. Please remember to drop a like if you enjoy, as it helps out the channel in a real way. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. It was supposed to be a simple case, recovering a missing person. The client was a CEO of a newspaper in Japan, but his son was studying abroad, right in my city. Lucky me. The boy was going by Nikki Imamura over here, and had stopped showing up for school and other engagements a month ago. As far as anyone knew then, his last words were telling a friend he was going to a local skate park. I wasn't the father's first choice, but I wasn't his last resort either. He was pulling out all the stops looking for his son, but so far, their traditional methods had failed. I was hired along with a number of other private detectives and fugitive recovery agents. We were all paid our normal rates, but the one to find the boy would receive a $2 million bonus if returned alive, and a $1 million bonus if his remains could be recovered with an explanation of what happened. Finding the boy wasn't easy, but I did it. Now I need help finding out exactly what happened so I can get the $1 million. I'll try my best to recount the last few days, and if anyone has a clue what's really going on, let me know it. This case turned weird quick. I skipped a few steps that I knew the police and other investigators would have done already. Nikki's computer, mail, and other belongings were being shared around, but they would take some time to reach me, so I began with a computer program I made myself. It searches the missing person reports and looks for people who might be connected. The father's lawyer had provided copies of school records and a psychological profile of Nikki. After reading it, my main takeaway was the boy studied hard but partied harder. My immediate hypothesis was Nikki had a secret group of friends. Some might just be suppliers, or even customers of Nikki himself, and maybe there was a special someone he'd always shoot up with. Regardless, these friends wouldn't be on his main Facebook page. Nikki would even pretend to not know them if they passed in the school hall. I figured if I was wrong about this angle, the other investigators would quickly track him down easily. But I knew if I was right, they were all looking in the wrong place. Thus, I fine-tuned the computer program to look for people around Nikki's age, regardless of which schools they went to, and I brought in the search radius. You'd be surprised how far people would travel for a fix. I remember thinking the best case scenario was if these friends had convinced Nikki to join a new age, technology-free cult. Worst case was if Nikki had been killed by a dealer or a customer in a bygone bad, and no one else was involved. However, the program surprised me with 5 results. 2 girls and 3 boys around Nikki's age had last been seen on the same day, August 30th, and at the same skate park that Nikki was last seen headed towards. I'm actually a big believer in coincidences. No, I don't think your dead grandma is hanging around as a ghost just because her favorite song came on the car radio, right as you pass by a street bearing her maiden name. The world is a big place with a lot of people in it. Most of the time, strange events have absolutely no greater purpose to them. I don't believe in aliens, lizard men, or witches, but I do have one superstitious vice. I believe in my gut, and it told me if I hit the jackpot when I saw those names scroll by, 3 were marked as resolved. Of the 2 girls, a girl was going to the same school as Nikki. I decided to start with her, Wendy Nguyen. Driving to her parents' place took all of 20 minutes. I told them I was hired by the police to help look for Wendy. Mr. and Mrs. Nguyen were only too happy to help. They revealed that the local police had just taken down Wendy's description, and no one had even bothered to look through her room. After explaining what I was looking for, tactfully, we went upstairs and combed through her belongings together. There was no smoking gun, no drug paraphernalia. Her parents were surprised to find dark clothes in the closet they didn't know about. but it only pointed to Wendy being a closeted goth. We did pull out her laptop, and Mrs. Nguyen was able to provide the answers to Wendy's security question to bypass the main password. Once in, I found a helpful Excel spreadsheet with all of Wendy's most used passwords. In fact, Wendy's obsession with organization proved to be extremely helpful. There were no references to drugs in her private messages to friends or anywhere else. But her calendar had August 30th marked with a meeting at the skate park. The note simply read, "Big score." I explained to Wendy's parents that score was slang for buying illicit drugs. They insisted her daughter could never get involved with something like that. But I didn't press the issue. Pulling up her search history revealed that she occasionally stalked the Facebook page of Nikki Imamura, even though she had never made a friend request. I felt like I had it all figured out then. The next big step would be to search the park for witnesses to Wendy and or Nikki's dealings, there before and on the date of disappearance. However, I wanted to follow up on the 3 resolved cases in that hopes that their attached police reports would shed more light on what could be going on at the park. Instead, they just opened up more mysteries, and in the strangest of ways. Plus, I got a bad feeling when I saw all 3 had been resolved with the finding of bodies. Abigail Williams was reported missing by her Dungeons and Dragons group after she missed a second session. She didn't have contact with any of her surviving family, and her retail job just assumed she quit. But the police found her immediately. She had never left her house. In fact, it looked like she had never left her room during the time she was missing, approximately 2 weeks. The coroner's report read death by kidney failure, caused by extreme dehydration. The police checked her fridge and found it to be full of sources of water, not the least of which were a half-dozen water bottles. Likewise, her faucets all worked, and her doors showed no signs of being locked or forced closed. I wondered just what kind of drug she was on. What would cause her to just sit in her room and literally waste away? Astonishingly, the blood analysis showed no drugs in her system. The police report for Alan Douglas was more straightforward. He'd only been missing for a couple of days before his body was found. Like Abigail, he was found at home, but dead of suicide this time. He left a note pre-apologizing for his action. In its entirety, "I'm sorry, but I'm not going to drag this out. There may be a solution, but we're not going to find it before it's too late. I hope what I'm about to do will hurt less in the end, but at least it will be over quick." I was amazed when reading the note. I had been hoping that the other cases really were coincidental, but this is when I started to believe otherwise. I needed new ideas because Alan simply had THC in his system, at a high enough level to prove he was an active user. Finally, Jimmy Miles was also the victim of suicide. In his case, the police already had the body and retroactively identified him when the missing person report was filed. Jimmy had thrown himself off a bridge into the Delaware River in a spectacular fashion. Witnesses say he ran around carrying a large rock that was tied to his waist before jumping. Weirdly, even with the stone, Jimmy's body was found in record time. It had washed ashore immediately. However, no note was ever found for him. None of the deceased had any obvious connections with each other, Wendy or Nikki. Because I was no longer sure of the drug angle, I went ahead and visited Chris Clay's home. He was the other missing person whose case hadn't been resolved. I used the same lines that got me access to Wendy's home, and they worked just as well with Chris's parents. Soon, I had ransacked. Right away I noticed a similarity in the dark clothes between Wendy and Chris owned, but Chris was an out and proud goth. Otherwise, the room itself didn't hold any answers, but once again, a laptop was uncovered. Unfortunately, Chris's parents weren't any help in knowing or guessing the password. The username was auto-filled in as Bytor. My first guess was Snowdog, which rewarded me with unlocking the account. Chris was more disorganized than Wendy, but I ended up learning much more from his notes. Even better, it was clear from his search history that he wasn't bothering to cover his tracks at all. He had a few Twitter messages with Wendy, which proved she was actively covering her tracks, and referenced everyone I had been looking at. They were indeed connected. Jimmy was something of their leader. He had come up with some brilliant idea to get away with a big score at the skate park. I was wrong about them being druggies. They were thieves. My mind was blown at the time because they seemed like hard-working, normal kids. Yet, I found more and more clues within the laptop that showed Chris was exhaustively researching weapons. intimidation techniques, and maps of the park and surrounding locations. One of his searches was weak points of human body. Even better, one of the maps had a nearby boathouse circled in red and marked Sanctuary/Rendezvous Point. I looked it up and found there used to be a small lake around there. It was drained years ago to reduce flooding in the area, but this boathouse was never torn down. I finally felt ready to go to the park then, but I waited until the next day before heading down. I wanted to get an early start. This proved fortuitous, as the very first person I met was a homeless man named Tom, who lived nearby. He told me the boathouse was off limits, the home of a woman whose name he had never learned. It was rumored she was a witch, but all he knew for sure was she was the meanest person he had ever met. In Tom's own words, usually there's a special kind of community here. We all look out for each other. She, on the other hand, wants to be left alone. You so much as bump into her, and you've made a mortal enemy. He knew from first-hand experience. Tom rolled up his sleeve to show scars on his upper arm. He laughed it off with, "Lady needs to cut her nails." But they looked more like claw marks of an animal to me. More importantly, at the time, was his account of 6 people dressed in black and meeting on August 30th. He gave them a wide berth due to weird vibes, and hadn't really gotten a good look, but could tell they were carrying duffel bags. I wondered why the boathouse would be selected as a rendezvous point, but it sounded like the nameless woman made so few public appearances that the kids might not have been aware of her presence. Either way, I went there next. The boathouse itself looked foreboding. It was in disrepair, and honestly, looked like it could collapse at any time, so there were multiple reasons to hesitate before opening the door. After knocking yielded no response, cardboard covered every window, so I couldn't peer in and prepare myself. Mentally, I pictured the worst, so I could prepare myself to act quickly if I needed to. Still, there was nothing that could prepare me for the horrors in that place. The rotting floorboards were soaked with blood. An elderly woman, the epitome of the word hag, was laying in the middle of the room with bullet holes in her head, chest, and stomach. A red thing laid next to her. That's honestly what I thought for a while. It was humanoid, but it's hard to believe it had ever been human. It was almost just a pile of gore. My gut feeling, which would later be confirmed correct, was there were the remains of Chris Clay. The rest of the room was scant on details of what happened. I found a gun nearby, empty. The nameless woman hadn't owned much, but there were several books that I leafed through. I could recognize them being in Latin, but I couldn't tell what exactly they were about. I called the police and did my own analysis of the bodies while waiting. The bodies were already smelling bad, but not to the point that the small living space was full of the stink yet. This told me both had died fairly recently, maybe 3 days ago. The old woman had a snarl permanently etched on her face. She probably died instantly from the one bullet to her head. The rest of the wounds looked non-fatal and randomly placed. Whoever did this wasn't a marksman. The thing had many 1 to 2 inch long cuts all over its body. Easily over 200 separate wounds, but the cause of death was probably due to the thing being disemboweled. Shockingly, I discovered an ugly looking dagger under the thing. I had been assuming the old woman had done this herself, but I had to consider the lacerations were self-inflicted, bizarre as that theory was. It took hours for the police to process the scene and take my statement. I just told them I had gone into the boathouse only out of curiosity. When I was free to go, I intended to leave immediately and call it a day. But on the way out, I saw a group of kids on the other side of the skate park running around. They were all wearing dark clothes, and several duffel bags laid nearby. I only had to watch them for a short while to realize they weren't any kind of dangerous gang. In fact, they were just playing a game. After talking to them, they inadvertently explained away the biggest mysteries to me. Nikki, Chris, all of them had been playing the same kind of game. They were pretending to be vampires and witches, and would actually go out to places around town to complete missions. The group explaining this was a rival family, who had indeed been victims of theft on August 30th, but it was all in-game. They hadn't known who it was at the time, but their best equipment and heirlooms, whatever that means, were taken. Armed with this new knowledge, I re-examined Wendy's and Chris's laptops, looking for explicit references to the game, and I immediately realized what an idiot I've been. Wendy's computer ended up being full of messages between her and Nikki. It's just they had been using their in-game names. Jezebel Torador and Rorschach Bruja. There were messages between them all. Jimmy was their game master and leader of their little clan, but Wendy and Nikki easily had 1,000 more messages between them. More than ever, I knew I'd find them together. Well, this was all very interesting. I wasn't really closer to finding Nikki's location, nor did it help me understand what had happened to the others. If the skate park was the headquarters for one family, I figured there would also be a special place Jimmy had the others meet up at. Now that I knew what I was looking for, I quickly found references to their home, and was able to find directions on getting there. There ended up being a bridge. Specifically, a maintenance tunnel accessible from under the bridge. Getting down there was easier said than done at my age, but I made it in one piece. It was getting dark, but I had a gut feeling that time was running out. After the boathouse, I had absolutely no idea what I'd find here. It certainly wasn't Wendy and Nikki both alive, but that's exactly what greeted me when I opened the unlocked maintenance door. Granted, they both looked horrible. Bruises covered their arms. They had cuts and scrapes that looked like defensive wounds. Both were gaunt and looked like they hadn't slept in days. They were just sitting on a mattress that lay directly on the ground. A single bare bulb lamp lit the entrance of this tunnel. Dozens of empty water bottles littered the ground. Nikki jumped at my intrusion, but Wendy barely batted an eyelash. Since neither one spoke, I did all the talking. I explained who I was and that I was here to help. Neither kid looked thrilled or angry or anything. They just looked tired. I called for an ambulance and reported into a network monitored by Nikki's father and my professional peers. The response was immediate. Mr. Mamura was on his way to the airport. He wanted to personally confirm Nikki was safe. However, I wasn't sure just how safe any of us were. In the back of my mind, I'd been worried about some kind of biological containment being to blame. You know, like some kind of brain-eating virus. If so, I would have been contaminated at some point working the trail. So all of us were seen by the paramedics who eventually arrived. I helped them carry the kids back up to the ambulance, and they all went to a nearby hospital. The doctors were stumped, as test after test showed there was nothing wrong with any of us. Worse, Wendy ended up passing away later that night. When I heard, I tracked down her doctor, and grilled him harder than I had ever done with actual criminals. He was adamant that his team was missing something, because the data didn't add up. It looked like Wendy had died of dehydration, but she had been hooked up to IV drips, and sweating profusely right before she died. While I left him more confused than ever, I knew what had to be done next. I entered Nikki's room and shook him awake. He was doing better than when I first saw him, but not by much. I told him he needed to start talking right away. We needed to know what happened to him and his friends before the doctors would have a snowball's chance in hell of treating him, and Wendy properly. I lied about Wendy, because I had a feeling we wouldn't have time for him to grieve. He looked up at me with the saddest eyes I had ever seen, and then he told me everything. They sneaked around the skate park, and each stole things from the rival family before meeting up at the boathouse. Chris had been there first and found the nameless woman's books. He thought these were more props used by the rival family, so he put one in his duffel bag. Of course, the old hag ended up coming home just as the kids were leaving. She noticed she was missing a book and ran at Chris demanding it back. Chris reached into his bag but pulled out a gun, shooting the woman dead. Obviously, when I heard this, I knew Nikki was confused. There was no way the corpse in the boathouse was over a month old, but I didn't correct him or interrupt him once so as to not break the flow of information. Everyone freaked out, but Jimmy took charge and ordered Chris to put the book back. He made them all agree it was self-defense, and the plan for everyone to keep silent and go on their own way for a while. But just as Chris pulled out the book and threw it across the room, they heard the woman's voice all around them. To the best of Nick's recollection, she said, "So you like to play as monsters and witches. How about a real curse? Aerophobic, cybophobic, or hydrophobic? Pick your poison." Nick swore her body got up and started swaying towards them while repeating the last sentence over and over. Her limbs moved around in unnatural ways, and all of the kids seemed dumbstruck until Nicky himself yelled out, "Hydrophobic." At this confession, he started to cry. I consoled him quickly. He didn't need to lose any more water. And he continued by saying, "I didn't know what she meant. Part of me somehow thought this was still the game. that Chris had been firing blanks and this woman was an actress. I thought our characters were being cursed with the fear of water. Not a bad idea for vampires. Of course, I don't believe Nicky was really being cursed, but it was clear that he believed it wholeheartedly. As he continued, it was clear that he didn't know exactly what happened with Jimmy, Alan, or Abigail, but he assumed they were dead. After Nicky picked his poison, the woman's body fell to the ground, and they found themselves able to move freely again. Chris and Wendy didn't feel right about going home to their parents, and Nicky wasn't going to leave Wendy's side, so they all went to their family's headquarters to lay low. It was supposed to be a temporary solution, but they quickly discovered something was wrong. At first, it was simply an aversion to drinking. They all eventually felt thirsty, but couldn't bring themselves to take even a sip. They made up for it at first by eating. There's water in everything after all, but soon, even that became impossible. Again, the hunger was there, but they couldn't take a bite. This led to the reason they had lasted this long. They took turns force-feeding each other. Those bruises and scrapes were the results of many violent but life-saving mealtimes. Yet, it wasn't enough. The curse kept getting stronger. Soon Chris was freaking out about the human body being 60% water. Wendy and Nicky tried to talk him down, but Nicky admitted he began to feel what Chris was talking about too. To them, it felt like their body wanted to escape. Chris started cutting himself to take the edge off, releasing more and more of his blood, his water, to keep it from hurting as much. Nicky also thought it was painful, but life was marginally better for him and Wendy. They had each other. As bad as the situation was, this was by far the longest time they had gotten to spend together. Chris fought them tooth and nail when it was their turn to feed him. They were far easier on each other, though it was always a struggle. In the end, they were literally tying each other up and injecting water directly into each other. They used syringes that Wendy had bought as props for the game. It worked well enough for them, but the pain was still getting worse. Chris kept cutting himself to the point of needing medical attention. Instead, he resolved to go back to the boathouse to finish what he started. He was convinced they needed to completely finish off the witch to end the curse. I then took the time to describe the state I had found Chris's body. Nicky didn't seem surprised. He said, "Yeah, sometimes I feel like ripping my body open to relieve the pain. But Wendy has always been there for me, and I help her. We both helped Chris, but when he found no solution at the boathouse, he probably went a little crazy." Yeah, just a little. Either way, I thought Nicky's story sounded accurate with the exception that this is definitely when Chris would have shot the woman. Nicky didn't have much more to say. The last week had been a miserable experience compared to everything before. They started throwing the little water they were getting. Nicky thanked me for getting them help. He was sure Wendy would have died this night otherwise. I started to make an excuse to leave, before I wanted to find the nearest nurse, and explain we needed to hook 3 or 4 IVs in the kid. I don't know how all that works, but we needed to do something like that. My theory is that the kids have some sort of group hallucination, mass hysteria, or whatever else you want to call it. Regardless, they believed they had this curse, and from there, these strange symptoms were all psychosomatic. After all, the mind is a powerful thing. But Nicky had other plans. As I stood up, I heard him grunt and then yell out in Japanese. I hadn't really heard the details of Wendy's passing, so I was unprepared for what happened to Nicky. First, he started sweating. Not bullets. This kid was sweating artillery shells. I swear I could see his pores stretching to past these large raindrops. And it was like it was raining, but only on this one kid. Sweat slid down him in cascading sheets. Tears poured out of his eyes just as quickly, and then turned white as he shut his eyes tightly and screamed in pain. I'm not sure if this was a sign of ocular fluid leaking from his eyes or what. Alarms were beeping all over the place, even though I could only hear them when Nicky had to pause from his screams to take a breath. Soon, nurses flooded the room. I was shooed to the side, but they were too busy to even ask me to leave. They moved around him quickly, but it was soon apparent that no one really knew what to do. Nicky managed to gasp out his last words. "Wendy, tell her I love her." Then, I kid you not, the kid started sweating blood. Thick drops of it beaded out from his head, his arms, his legs, and flowed with the sweat onto the bed sheets. Nicky's teeth began to crack from his tightly held grimace of pain, but suddenly everything relaxed. Nicky's body just deflated. Then the room was silent except for an uninterrupted beep of the heart monitor. And that's it. Nikki's dead. The CDC is locking down the hospital, with me still inside, because they're concerned about biological warfare being involved. The doctors don't understand anything about any of these cases. And Mr. Amamura will be here shortly. As far as I know, he's still expecting his son to be alive. So, I better gather a good explanation for him, but I am confounded as to what's really going on. Any and all assistance would be much appreciated. I did call the coroner to check up on any answers from the old woman's autopsy, but he surprised me with the news that her body was stolen before they could get to it. The police were on it, but so far it was a total mystery. The morgue had been locked up tight. I told them to keep me informed, and we'll see what the police come up with. After all, corpses don't just get up and walk away. In terms of anonymous online job postings, it was the strangest one I'd ever answered. The ad offered a ludicrous amount of money for a single day's worth of work. What that work would be wasn't really spelled out. The only information provided was an address, the promise of $5,000, and one short sentence describing the nature of the task. You'll be helping Dr. Paulo. He is trying to save the world. Pretty ambitious of the doctor, but for $5,000, I was fine enabling some crackpot's fantasies. Lord knows I've done worse for less. That's how I found myself standing in front of a quiet office park at 4 AM this morning. Hoodie pulled tight against the early autumn chill, chewing my lip and trying to puzzle out how such a weird job led to such a cozy location. The office buildings were clean white and chrome, the plaza in between well groomed and crossed with cobble pathways that ran artfully from building to building like stone rivers. There were even tiny bonsai trees. What a trip. I double-checked the address on the posting and walked towards the appropriate office. I did a subtle pat against the concealed holster on my right hip, just to remind myself it was there. Technically, I didn't have a concealed carry permit, or handgun license for that matter, but with the unregulated kind of work I did, I figured it was worth the risk, especially for today. Working with the kind of doctor who posts anonymous jobs to the web and promises to pay in cash, that's a lot of red flags if you're the kind of person who prefers to keep their organs snug and comfortable in their original packaging. Still, $5,000 for one day's worth of work was too tempting to write off entirely. So I told myself I'd scope the guy out, then cut and run if I got a bad vibe. The tidy office park put me a little at ease, I'll admit. I was expecting an abandoned warehouse or meat packing plant, or a deserted junkyard at the edge of town that only serviced ice cream trucks and panel vans. The usual. The lobby lights were off, but the building's door was unlocked. I walked in cautiously, and soft lights snapped to life. My hand was halfway to my holster before I realized the lights were on motion sensors. The interior was a mirror image of the exterior. White, polished, full of marble and modern angles. It was trendy. I didn't like it. There was no one at the front desk, but as I drew closer, I noticed a big blue post-it on the counter. Dear, my name. Half of your money is behind the desk. The rest will be paid upon completion. Please meet me in room 8. Dr. P. I walked behind the desk and found a large red duffel bag. Inside of the bag were several stacks of fresh $20 and $50 bills. I'll be damned, I said. Here was the money, half of it at least. There was the door. I nearly walked out, and I wish I had. But my curiosity was like gasoline in search of a fire. I simply could not help myself. I walked down the hall, counting doors until I reached room 8. The door was unlocked. Shit, I whispered. The room was cavernous, much larger than what I would have expected. Larger than should have fit in the entire building. Hospital beds stretched in neat rows and aisles as far as I could see in every direction. Small white cots with white blankets in a room as pale as a deep-dwelling fish that had never seen the sun. Everything was spotless, but everything, everywhere, was sickness. You could smell it on the air. The nauseously sweet odor of rotting things and bodies dying slow deaths. Everywhere I looked I saw misery, people writhing in pain on the cots, sweating and moaning. A few were begging, many more were silent. There was another sound as well, faint but persistent. It took me a moment to realize it was Muzak. Quiet, cheerful elevator music. Several rows to my left, I noticed a man bent over a bed, checking the pulse of an unmoving body lying tangled in sheets. The man stood up and turned towards me. I started to shake. The man was dressed as a doctor. White coat, tie, stethoscope, and all, but I couldn't see his face. He was wearing a black mask with huge eyes and a long beak. Slowly, he raised a hand and gave me a little wave, then turned and pointed. That was where he wanted me to go. While I stood there, my mind stuck on loading, unable to process the scene. Another doctor in a black bird mask wandered. He was whistling. The second doctor stopped when he noticed me. Then he too gave me a little wave and pointed to the same destination. No, I whispered. Please. The doctors just stood pointing. A third doctor approached from I'm not sure where. She was dressed identically to the other two and carried a chart. She didn't bother waving when she came close, only pointed. Her foot tapped in a pantomime of impatience, and I felt a heavy dread settle in my stomach. Okay, I said. I began to walk. As I went past the rows and rows of beds, I saw nightmares I could have never imagined. I watched a masked doctor comfort a woman with a pat on her hand, while she shrieked as something inside of her began clawing its way out. In another bed, several doctors held down a man as he jerked and twitched, massive red pustules forming, and bursting across his chest so rapidly I could hear them pop. The smell was staggering. Not far away, another woman had fallen from her cot and lay tangled in a pile of wires. I drew closer and realized the cords that wrapped around her weren't wires. They were greasy blue veins. While she tried to stand and rip some of the veins loose, I saw they were connected to her. Somehow, they'd just gone from inside her body to out. She didn't scream when she ripped the veins. She only sunk back to the floor into a fast-growing puddle of her blood. A doctor approached her with a mop, but I did not stay to watch. After what felt like hours walking among the dead and dying, I finally reached a door. This is where the masked doctors had sent me. The door was unusually tall, bright red with a frosted glass panel. Above the panel was a name written in golden letters. Dr. Paulo. Feeling like I was in a fever dream, I knocked. "Come on in," said a voice on the other side of the glass. I opened the door and was immediately blinded by a beautiful golden light. I screamed in pain and joy. I'm not sure which feeling was stronger. "Sorry," said the voice. "Forgot about that." The light was gone, but all I could see was blackness. "Yeah?" The voice continued. "Looks like we burned those out. That must have smarted something awful. Hold on, we will patch you right up." I felt a hand reach out and touch my face. Not just touch, but enfold. The darkness lifted and my vision returned, blurry but quickly clearing. The room was well lit and comfortable, spacious but dominated by a large desk in the center. A man sat behind the desk, smiling slightly at me. He was dressed like the doctors in the ward, except this man wasn't wearing a mask. His face was flawless, inhuman in its perfection, like a statue come to life. "It's good to meet you," he said. "I've been waiting so very long for today." The man stood up, and I saw that he was tall, impossibly tall. He didn't so much stand as unfold himself from behind the desk. "My name is Dr. Paulo," he told me. I couldn't speak. I couldn't find any words. Dr. Paulo's smile widened. "I understand. Today's a big day." He winked and reached behind his desk. "The rest of your money," the doctor said, handing me an identical red bag to what I found in the lobby. His hands were so large, he only used his thumb and index finger to hold the duffel. "Plus a little extra. Called a bonus for being timely." I clutched the bag to my chest, mouth working, still unable to speak. Finally, I managed to choke out a few words. "You said the ad? You need an assistant?" The doctor shook his head. "No, I have assistants. My little bird's out there. What I need from you is much more important. I need your help spreading the cure." "The cure for what?" "The cure for you," he said. "Why don't you have a seat?" I plopped down instantly. Luckily, a chair was somehow behind me. I held the bag closer, a security blanket. Dr. Paulo sat down on the edge of his giant desk. "I don't understand." I said. What do I need cured? No, the cure isn't for you. The cure is for everything else. You are the disease. I shook my head. I don't. You, he continued. All of you people, humans. You are the greatest plague ever inflicted upon this planet. You burn and you kill, and you take and you pollute, and you use and you breed, and your offspring continue the cycle in an ever worsening spiral. You were given paradise and you poisoned it. You were given everything and you ruined it, spoiled it, used it all up, and never showed an ounce of gratitude at the unfathomable depth of gifts and blessings you so casually healed into the dirt. You are a plague. You are the plague, and I have spent so very, very long looking for a cure. I've tried so many times throughout history, but always you managed to survive, to outbreed your losses, to come back worse than you were before. He leaned back and chuckled. You're like aggressive bacteria, harder to kill than cockroaches, but cockroaches, at least, have personality. So for the sake of the cockroaches, and every other thing that walks, swims, flies, or crawls, for the sake of the deep water and the soft skies, the trees tied to the earth, and the wind that touches those trees like a lover, for them, and for the rest of the planet, I have created a cure, and you will carry it to the rest of your ugly little species. I was crying silently. As he spoke, I saw images of every casual horror, every atrocity mankind ever wrought. I saw forest fires dance behind his eyes, heard atomic bombs drop in the silence between his words. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, I said. The doctor leaned forward. I know, the sorriest thing I've ever seen, but today you can rise above the blood and muck and violence of your previous life. Today you can help me save the world. Why me? I whispered. He shrugged. You answered the ad. Are you ready? I couldn't speak. Paulo smiled again, then leaned closer. He filled up my vision. He was an eclipse. As I sat trembling, the doctor gently kissed my forehead. The dread I'd carried with me since I'd opened door 8 finally bloomed into numb acceptance. In the kiss I felt a transfer, something insubstantial but inevitable, as heavy and as hidden as guilt. You are my cure, he told me as he drew back. Now go, travel, explore, spread. I woke up alone in my apartment. That was 3 days ago. I've convinced myself that I was drugged, that the doctor must have tested some kind of hallucinogens on me, some new drug, something vivid. I'd say the entire experience was a dream except that there were 2 red duffel bags swollen with cash in the corner of my room. Enough money to get away, enough money to see the world, but to do that, I would need to leave my apartment and, the truth is, I've been feeling a little under the weather the past few days. Time waits for no man though. So this morning, I booked tickets for a flight, for a trip. We're living in strange times. There are reports of a red star in the sky and people going crazy. You never know how much time you have left. I think I should see the world while I can. It's almost like there's a little voice in my head telling me to go. So I'll walk down to the pharmacy later, stock up on meds for the plane ride. This new cough is becoming persistent. Then I'll pack my bags, and I'll take my cash, and I'll go on a grand adventure. This story happened to me a few years ago, and it's 100% true. For reference, I'm a girl and was probably around 16 at the time, living with my mom, dad, younger brother, and dog in a house built in 2001. No one has ever lived here before us. It was around midnight or 1 in the morning, and I was sitting alone on the couch in the living room. The TV in front of me was a random channel on low volume, but I was watching YouTube on my laptop. This was over the summer, so it wasn't uncommon for me to be up late watching something out loud on my computer. My parents were, to my knowledge, asleep upstairs, and my brother was either asleep or playing video games upstairs. I was always fairly quiet, as my parents' bedroom is at the top of the stairs, quite close to the living room. You know how you can tell who's coming down the stairs based on how it sounds? Well, as I was watching my laptop, I heard my mom come down the stairs. The stairs were next to the living room through the doorway, just the frame without a door, and I was facing towards where they are, but I couldn't see them from where I was sitting. Anyway, I heard my mom come about halfway down the stairs and whisper my name. as if to ask if I was down there. It was in that voice where I could tell she had just woken up and was a little bit annoyed at the thought of no longer being asleep. I responded, sort of quietly because it was late. "Yeah?" No response back. I leaned to the side so I could see a little less than the bottom half of the stairs, and I saw nothing. I found it a bit weird, but I figured she must have just wanted me to keep it down, and had gone back upstairs to get back into bed, and I just didn't hear her. So I lowered the volume on the TV and my computer, and continued doing what I was doing. About 10 minutes later, I heard my dad come about halfway down the stairs. And I could tell it was him by the way it sounded, after he called my name. Sounding tired and a tad bit more annoyed than my mom did, I said again, "Yeah?" This time a little louder than I had before, thinking maybe my mom didn't hear me the first time. Once again, I heard no response, no steps back upstairs, and at this point, I'm scared. I leaned to the side to look at the stairs and saw nobody. I called out, "Dad?" One more time, and after no response, turned off the TV, grabbed my laptop, and cautiously went upstairs. My parents' bedroom door was shut, and I peeped in to see if they were awake. It was pitch black in there, as usual, but once my eyes adjusted, I could see both my parents and our dog asleep in bed. My parents can fall asleep quickly, but not that quickly. If my dad just came down the stairs about 2 minutes before, he should have noticed me walk into their bedroom. I left and closed the door behind me, more freaked out than I was before. I knocked on my brother's door, and he was awake playing video games on his computer. I asked him if mom and dad were asleep, and he told me they were as far as he knew, and that they hadn't talked to him in a few hours. So I went to my room and tried my best to sleep. In the morning, my mom and dad were in the kitchen eating breakfast. So I asked them if they heard me downstairs late last night, and they said they hadn't. I also asked if either of them had called for me down the stairs, and they both said no. I told them what happened, and they were both a little freaked out. However, my mom brushed it off as me hearing things because it was late, and my dad teased me about the house being haunted. To this day, I have no idea what it was. My parents would not have lied to me about that, especially if it required them to stay up late or keep up a lie for years. I wasn't watching anything scary downstairs, so I wasn't paranoid or on edge when my mom came downstairs the first time. My house shouldn't be haunted, as it's brand new, and I had no reason to have been hallucinating that night. I just don't understand how it sounded exactly how my parents walk and talk. All I know is that something came down the stairs that night, but it wasn't my parents. This story takes place about 10 years ago, give or take. My friends and I had just graduated from high school, and that summer, we all decided we should do something memorable before we started college. At the time, only one of us had a car. Our group consisted of Eric, James, Carl, Alex, and myself. To this day, we remain best friends. James is married and has a baby girl. Eric, Carl, and Alex are attending college. I myself am working at a dead-end job. But back to the story. We would always sleep over at one of our houses during the summer months. I live in a town that, at the time, and to this day, continues to grow. Before all of the recent shopping centers and new housing developments started, my town was surrounded by woods, walking trails, and the like. One night, Eric and Alex, the muscle and brains of our group, respectively, hatched an idea. In my town, there were abandoned, unused houses all over the place. Keep in mind these houses are now gone, as mentioned before. Our plan was simple. We would tell our parents the old tactic of saying we'd be spending the night at one of our houses. Eric, who had an ancient Chevy Trailblazer, was the wheels behind our plan. Alex, the silver-tongued devil that he is, convinced all the parents we were spending the night at my place. In reality, we were planning to drive around all night, exploring supposedly haunted houses and locations in my area. Little did we know, we were in for one hell of a night. 11 rolls around, and my folks are dead asleep. One by one, we all sneak out of my room, out to where Eric parked the Blazer. At this time, Alex seemed off to me. He was looking pale, like the blood in his face was being drained little by little. I asked him if he was doing alright, grabbing his shoulder. Before he answered, I felt a cold sweat on his shoulder. He said he was fine, so we continued with our plan. We had eaten a ton of McDonald's chicken sandwiches and cheeseburgers, packed some light snacks into my backpack, along with a pair of flashlights I had nabbed from my pops, and headed out to our first destination. It was a 10-minute drive from my house, and as we neared this place, I could feel dread forming in the pit of my stomach. I could also see Alex, who was riding shotgun in Eric's car, growing more and more pale. Soon, we would be arriving at the haunted house, as I was giving directions from the back seat. Once I saw the street leading to this house, Alex was ghost white. We couldn't get him to say a word. Allow me to explain where this house was located. It was behind some new houses, down a long dirt road, surrounded by tall trees that gave it an even more ominous vibe to the already dreary location. I saw the solitary streetlight that I was accustomed to seeing, and told Eric to pull over so we could talk to Alex, and see why he was acting so shook up. As Eric pulled over, James, Carl, and I kept prodding Alex with pointless and frankly dumb questions. We teased and mocked him for his reaction. Then Eric pointed something out to me through all the criticism targeted at Alex. "Why is the road so dark, Liam?" he asked as we stared at the street. I hushed everyone up, surprised to see Eric was right. This light usually lit up the road quite well, despite its age. Yet, from the spot where we had parked, the streetlight only lit up about 5 feet in front of us. The pole must need a new bulb, I told everyone in the car. At that very moment, Alex saw how dark the street was and simply stated, "No, we gotta get out of here now." As he said this, Eric and I made eye contact and decided to continue our little ghost hunting trip. Eric put his blazer into drive, much to the reluctancy of Alex, James, and even Carl. Carl was the daredevil of our group, yet even he was having second thoughts about continuing. I could see beads of sweat forming on everyone's foreheads, excluding Eric and myself. At this point, he and I grew impatient, and I told Eric to punch it. Eric turned onto the creepy road, only to find that his headlights weren't working properly. I instructed him to hit the high beams. Suddenly my heart dropped. As the truck flickered the brights on, we were still unable to penetrate the inky darkness surrounding us. This is when James, Alex, Carl, and I started to regret ever leaving my house. Eric, unfazed by our collective reaction, decided for us. He put the pedal to the metal. Alex jumped in his seat as we started moving closer to where this place was located. I screamed to Eric to hit the brakes. As he did, we all jolted forwards in our seats. As we looked at our surroundings, we were mere inches from the hill that housed our end goal. Eric looked wide-eyed at our position, realizing that if we had stopped moments later, we would have hit a mound of dirt and dead grass. Suddenly, Alex started to grasp his chest. He was coated in sweat, almost drenched in it. His eyes looked on the massive tree that hid the structure, and gasped for any meager of air. He looked Eric dead in the eyes, and managed to get one word out. "Go." Without warning, we were speeding in reverse out of the forsaken road. Halfway down the street, we flipped around and drove back to my house. Not a word was spoken until we arrived to my room. Alex's face finally started to regain its color. Carl and James were silent. Eric and I kept exchanging awkward glances at one another. Finally, Alex spoke up, breaking the stifling silence. He recalled that before we left my house for the night, he started getting an eerie feeling of dread and danger in the pit of his stomach. After all the adrenaline wore off, we all focused our attention to Alex. Before, we had joked and poked fun at him, thinking he was trying to freak the rest of us out. That is, until the moment he showed us his neck and torso. He had a purple mark from his neck down. After that, we all called it a night and drifted to uncomfortable sleep. In the morning, everyone picked up their belongings and headed home. After that, we all pretended like it never happened. Over the years, the house was inevitably torn down for new housing developments. A few years after that incident, I took my own car down to that old, decrepit place. There was nothing there but forklifts and a mess of wood. As I reminisced of that night, I started getting chills. As I was getting back into my car, it wouldn't start. My car was a newer model bought from a dealership a few cities from where I lived. This had never happened to me before. Try as I might though, it refused to start. It wasn't until I prayed to God to get me out of there. After a few more tries of trying, my car finally turned over. Suffice to say, I sped away from that place, and I never looked back. As the years passed, we grew up. Forgot all about that experience we all shared that day. Our group is a tight-knit, religious, and loyal party. Yet, we still have no idea what really happened that night so many years ago. One summer vacation when I was a kid, my mom, older brother, and I stayed with my maternal grandmother in rural southeastern Ohio while my parents were going through a trial separation. She lived near a small town called Beaver on Salem Cave Road. Yes, you can find it on Google Maps, but unfortunately there's no street view out in the boonies. I was about 9 years old, which would have made my brother 15. There isn't a whole lot to do in the Appalachia, so we would mostly just explore the nearby forest to pass those first few summer days. Not too long into the summer, we came across a small, relatively shallow cave hidden fairly deep in the woods. When we told my grandma about the cave we'd found, she told us that when she was a little girl, people in the area would often say that cave was cursed. She said it was in fact the Salem Cave, after which the road was named. And the cave, in turn, was named after a witch who had supposedly fled from Salem, Massachusetts, during the infamous witch trials and had resettled in the area. The so-called witch was rumored to have kidnapped people for satanic rituals that she performed in the cave. My grandma was a superstitious lady, and she told us not to play around the caves. My mom agreed, albeit for more practical reasons. She didn't want us getting hurt. Of course, we didn't heed those warnings, and we decided we were going to try to make the forested area surrounding the cave into a park of sorts. We took an old axe that had belonged to my grandpa before he passed away from Grandma's shed, and from then on, we spent most of our daylight hours out at the cave cutting down small trees, making paths, and arranging stones to line those paths. Things were totally fine at first, and we had a lot of fun. We were a little creeped out by my grandma's story of a curse, but the cave felt like a secret clubhouse all to ourselves. Besides, it was the only thing to do for miles since Grandma didn't even have cable, but after a couple weeks, we started noticing some strange things happening here and there. Nothing too alarming, but nothing we could easily explain either. We used a small ATV to ride back and forth between Grandma's house and the cave, since it was about 2 miles between the two, and about a week in, we somehow completely lost track of the worn path we'd been using. We had to wear in a new one. Despite having used the same path many times before, we never did find the original path again. A few times, we found obstacles like large stones or logs blocking the path we'd just used the day before. Again, nothing major, but little things that unsettled us. It seemed like the more time we spent near the cave, the worse things got. One day, after a few hours of labor, me moving rocks to outline paths, while my brother laboriously chopped down trees that stood in the way, we decided to take a break to eat the small lunch that Grandma had packed for us. My brother left Grandpa's old axe on the ground above the cave entrance, and we walked to a nearby clearing where we'd set up a makeshift table and chairs out of logs. After we'd finished our sandwiches, we planned to get back to work. However, although we were both sure of where the axe had been left above the cave, we couldn't find it. We searched and searched, thinking maybe the wind had kicked up while we ate and blown leaves over it or something like that. After probably an hour of searching, I finally found the axe. It was inside Salem Cave, leaning against a stone wall at the very deepest point. My brother and I had been together the entire time since he put the axe down. Needless to say, we were pretty freaked. It was impossible for the axe to have gotten there without someone or something moving it, and we were very much under the impression up until that point that we were alone in the forest. To say nothing of the alleged curse, the idea of some redneck out in the woods messing with a couple of kids didn't sit too well with us. We packed up our things quickly and drove the ATV back home with the intention of never going back out there again. Unfortunately, there was one thing we forgot when we packed up for what we thought would be the last time. In our panic, we'd completely forgotten to grab the axe and had left it in the cave where I'd found it. Under any other circumstances, there's no way we would have gone anywhere near that cave again, but the axe had belonged to my deceased grandpa, and we'd never asked permission to use it in the first place. We knew that if Mom or Grandma found out, we'd lost it, let alone that we'd be going to the forbidden cave every day for the last month. We'd be in huge trouble. We decided it was worth it to go back one last time, For this final part of the story, I need to mention that my brother has a pretty intense fear of stinging insects that stems from finding a neighbor dead from anaphylactic shock when he was younger. The neighbor had been stung something like 40 times by a swarm of wasps, and my poor brother found him outside his garden shed, already dead. I'm sure anyone can imagine why that'd be pretty scarring for a young kid. It might lead to something approaching a full-on phobia. Anyway, as we got closer and closer to the cave, we started to hear a faint buzzing. Bugs weren't our first assumption, since the sound was loud enough to be heard over the engine of the ATV. Still, my brother killed the engine to try and figure out what was going on. When we couldn't find any obvious source of the buzzing, we started the vehicle up again and continued on our way. The buzzing only continued to increase in volume as we approached, and my brother told me he was scared. I told him I didn't want to get in trouble, and that we'd be in and out before anything bad could happen. He reluctantly agreed and we pressed on, but the sound just kept getting louder. By the time we were within a few hundred yards of the cave, the buzzing was so loud we could hardly stand it. There was still nothing around. No power lines, no swarms of insects, nothing that would buzz at all, let alone at twice the volume of a 250cc engine. It didn't matter to my brother though. He had gotten it into his head that the buzzing sound was coming from a swarm of bees, ready to sting him to death, and if there was even a chance of that being true, he wanted nothing to do with it. He turned the ATV around, and we absolutely booked it back home, despite my constant protests about us getting in trouble. He was driving so recklessly that he hit a large stump, throwing us both from the ATV. In his panic, he didn't even stop to check if either of us had any injuries, and we jumped right back onto the vehicle. By the time we got back to the house, he was in tears. He completely spilled everything to our mom and grandma, and as it turned out, he had broken his thumb in the crash, without even realizing thanks to his adrenaline. Thankfully, I wasn't injured. As expected, we weren't allowed to go back out into the woods at all for the rest of the summer. Not that we would have wanted to, after everything that had happened. I don't think either of us even complained about being bored inside after that. We never did get Grandpa's axe back, and to this day, we don't know what was going on at that cave, or where the deafening buzzing sound came from. Was it some bored hillbilly pranking a couple of kids, or was it something more supernatural, playing on our fears to get us to leave? As far as either of us is concerned, the Witch of Salem cave can keep the axe. It's been 20 years, and neither of us would be caught dead anywhere near that place. Lately, I've been feeling uneasy. I've been seeing things out of the corner of my eyes. Black figures that disappear the moment I look at them. This is abnormal to me, but it isn't something that hasn't happened to me before. All throughout my life, I've seen things that others don't generally experience. That being said, this was unlike any other experience I've ever had. Although, it happened in a dream, so I can't even say with complete honesty that it was real. So why did it feel so real? It was real, wasn't it? Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me backtrack. So this happened last night / this morning. I'm not sure. I was asleep. I usually have pretty vivid dreams. I can control most of them, and I can almost always remember them. They're usually very bizarre, but not so unbelievable that you would automatically think you're dreaming. Nothing was different before bed last night. I went to the bathroom, brushed my teeth, and washed my face. I kicked the dogs off my bed and laid down next to my partner. Same as usual. I did have to wake up early this morning, so I went to bed a couple hours early. Here's where the dream starts. I was outside in the grass and the sun was setting. I laid out there for a bit enjoying the warmth from the sun, and the cool breeze coming in from nightfall. I headed inside the house after some time. I entered the house, or so I thought. The outside was my house, but once I walked through the door, it was a white room. Inside of this white room was nothing but a bed and my partner, smiling at me. I went and sat down next to him, and he looked at me. He asked me a question, but I couldn't hear him. "Can you repeat that?" I asked him. "Have you ever seen the Shadow Man?" My heart jumped. The Shadow Man? What the hell was he talking about? "No. Have you?" I replied. That uneasy feeling hit me. I felt like throwing up. I wanted to wake up, but I couldn't. I couldn't do anything but let things play out. "Yeah, let me show you." He grabbed my arm and started tracing along my skin with his fingertips. He did the same pattern over and over again, until his nails started digging into my skin. I didn't flinch. I didn't react. I couldn't react. I trust my partner, but at this moment, I was terrified of what was coming. This didn't feel like my partner. Suddenly, I saw a black figure out of the corner of my eye. My partner then put his hand on my head, and I fell back on the bed, with what felt like it was supposed to be excruciating pain in my head. Instead, it was conveyed to me as intense pressure in my skull. I couldn't move and started panicking. It felt like my body was convulsing, but I think I was just trying to move and failing. The shadow man started walking towards me, and as he got closer to my face, he disappeared into my head. I started convulsing more and more, and then I woke up. No explanation. No shadow man. My partner was happily sleeping beside me. Everything was normal. Except for the sweat pouring down my face. The panic was subsiding, but I still felt uneasy. I haven't lost the feeling of uneasiness all day. I can't stop thinking about the shadow man and how real my dream was. My head feels pressure. Nothing feels real. And I can't stop seeing shadowy figures. I have a feeling he's coming for me. This was too real to be fake. I don't know what to do. I'm so scared to sleep again.